Hello there, Beat Check listeners. This is Shane Dixon Kavanaugh, Portland City Hall reporter for the Oregonian Oregon Live, and I am here today with a very special guest, my friend and professional colleague, Mike Rogoway. Mike is a business reporter at our paper and also just an all-around outstanding human being. So why don't you say hello, Mike?
Good morning, Shane, and thank you for the kind words.
It's great to see you again, as always. And why don't you tell our listeners, where are we right now having this conversation?
Well, we're both downtown. We're in the office, fifth floor, just south of the Oregonian's offices, which is just south of the Waterfront Marriott. For technical reasons, we're in separate rooms, even though we're both in the newsroom. I
It's
don't
a it's
know.
a it's a little silly, right?
Yes,
I'm
I'm looking out. I'm looking east, out at um, I guess the Markham Bridge and Silicon Crossing, and out toward Mount Hood. Uh, across the eastern edge of downtown in the waterfront.
I wish I had that kind of view right now. Unfortunately, I'm in a room that's not affording much of one at all, but that's okay. Anyway, aside, we'll wrap up kind of the silly banter here. But part of the reason why I bring that up is, part of the reason why I invited you to join me today with this conversation is because both of us want to talk a little bit about downtown Portland, which is where we are right now. Where both of us spend quite a bit of time in and out of the newsroom, and I'm at City Hall, and you're bouncing around in places, but. So we chat a lot about Portland's city center, its central city, and I think both of us are pretty interested in this as an ongoing both news story, but also a story about just the overall civic health of Oregon's largest city. And so I thought this could be a fun opportunity to chat a little bit about that and just do sort of a temperature and status check with where things are right now with downtown Portland.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, we this is a subject of abiding interest for us and I think our readers.
Yeah, well, tell me a little bit, or tell our listeners a little bit, like why do we spend so much time writing and reporting on and thinking about downtown Portland?
Well, I think part of it for me goes back to the degree to which downtown for Portland, even more than most cities, I would say, downtown is part of the city's identity and part of the way it pictures itself. You know, we go back to the Vera Katz era and Pioneer Courthouse Square and Portland's living room. The idea is that Portland was going to have this livable, walkable downtown that would be a draw for people, a place to work, a place to shop, entertainment, place to eat, dine, a place to really hang out. And I think probably more than most cities, it had achieved that in the years leading up to the pandemic. It was aided by the fact that there was this revival of the tech community in Portland, and there was an influx of technology companies downtown, startups and outposts from larger companies elsewhere, like New Relic and Amazon and eBay and Google, and all that kind of. Portland's story is by no means unique as far as what happened to downtown with the pandemic, but it's really shaken up, I think, the city's identity. The fact that fewer people are coming downtown, the fact that office buildings are empty, rise in visible homelessness, perceived rise in crime. So we've for a couple of years we've done sort of occasional series around this. In 2021, when we were sort of setting out to say, okay, take the temperature downtown and get a sense of where it's going, we asked people in the Portland area. We took a poll of people across the region, and we asked them, "Is downtown important to you?" And 85% said it was important or very important. So it matters. And then there's one additional element that, again, this isn't necessarily different from other cities, but it's important economically. Investors and banks have a lot tied up in downtown real estate, and if downtown real estate isn't paying for itself, that is going to have an effect on the property owners and those who lend the money, and that may have a broader effect regionally as well as nationally.
One thing that I often think about as a Portland resident and as somebody who covers this city is that while, and you've made this observation just now, a lot of the city's identity historically has been wrapped up in sort of its downtown. We're also this city that is largely defined by its neighborhoods, many of which have sort of thriving commercial corridors all throughout Portland, which in some ways de incentivizes people from going downtown or spending time here in a way in which folks in other cities around the country might not. And I've kind of wondered about that because on the one hand, as you're mentioning, the public opinion survey we took a couple of years ago, where so many people are saying that 85% of people say that that downtown is important to Portland, yet there's also sometimes not a great reason to come down here. And I'm wondering if you've ever sort of how you've kind of balanced those two things, both in terms of your reporting about the sort of economic health of the city, but also as just a longtime resident of here as well.
Well, I think that's a great observation, Shane, and I think it's definitely true that for instance, Portland's good and great restaurants are pretty well distributed throughout the city in the neighborhoods. It's not that there are great restaurants downtown, but it's not like you have to come downtown to find a great place to eat or a certain type of food uh, that that might not be available elsewhere. It is pretty well distributed, and I think the pandemic uh, maybe made people a little more neighborhood focused as people were working from home. They could get what they need, you know, without going more than 20 blocks from where they live. And that's, what is it that draws people downtown if it's not work and it's not some, casual everyday kind of amenity? Downtown still seems to be doing pretty well when it comes to festivals or sporting events, things like that. But the sort of everyday casual, hey, I'm going to get a bite to eat, or I'm going to the office, or there's a particular shop I want to go to. I suspect you're right, that people are finding that in their own neighborhoods. Oh, we do see some data around that. We wrote, a month or a month and a half ago, looking at retail storefront vacancies. And uh, across the metro area, they pretty much stayed constant throughout the pandemic. Downtown, though, uh, they they have more or less doubled since 2019 the number of vacancies. So it's a it's a real thing, and it's a good observation.
Let me ask you this, just on a personal note. So we don't have at this point in time in our newsroom, we don't have sort of a mandatory return to work policy in any sort of real sense. And in a lot of ways now in the news business, that having everybody in a newsroom isn't needed. But you were one of the folks, in our newsroom who spends a lot of time downtown in our office. And I'm just wondering what brings you down here day after day, even if you don't have to be here.
Well, I think one thing downtown has going for it is that it's very accessible. And I'm fortunate enough to I just live a few miles from here, and I live along a series of bikeways that I can ride a bike in downtown without any particular trick. It only takes me 15 to 20 minutes tops. So it's very easy for me to get down here. I'm also fortunate and I have a good workspace at home, but it happens to be in the basement. And we're fortunate here at the office. We have a very well lit office with some excellent views, and I want to take advantage of that. That said, I do believe, even in a newsroom where we're very externally focused, we're more concerned about what's happening outside the newsroom than what's happening inside it. It is useful to be around other people and to be in a workplace with your colleagues where you can compare ideas and you know come up with a shared sense of direction. And beyond that, Shane, you're downtown to for events at City Hall, for other kinds of civic events all the time. Same's true for me. There are a number, okay, a lot of tech companies have moved from hybrid to maybe increasingly remote, but there are a lot of people still downtown, and it's a easy, convenient place to meet up with people if you want to talk to somebody with a business and get a sense of what they're up to.
Certainly. I also personally just like being in the central city, walking around, just observing things. It gives me the opportunity to just sort of do a regular sort of status check. How are things going? We there's a lot of quantitative data that you've had the chance to look at over the last couple of years, but there are sort of qualitative indicators as well. Certainly, vibes alone should not be sort of driving the overall narrative of a place, but that's important too. And I think it's for me to do the work that I do, writing about just how the city is functioning in terms of its local government as a whole. Spending a lot of time in the central city and in downtown, even if I'm not at City Hall or in our newsroom, but you get, at least in my line of work, I get a pretty good read of what's sort of working right now and what's not working just by being out in the world a bit.
That's a great observation. Certainly during the pandemic, particularly during those first months when people were staying at home, or during the wildfires in September 2020, uh, I was, of course, right in the middle of Portland, but I felt really disconnected from it because I wasn't getting out as often as I would like and getting a real sense of what was happening around day to day, the temperature check, as you say, just seeing what people are doing. Anecdotal things that you get from just walking around any neighborhood in Portland. You get that by getting out. That's an important part of reporting.
Now remind me if you have these numbers handy, or numbers that might exist sometime within the last few months or 6 months or a year. But how many, in terms of people that we're surveying or polling occasionally, uh, people in Portland or in the metro area, how many folks are actually coming to downtown these days? Or when was the last time somebody was down here? If they've been contacted about this.
Well, so we've done a couple polls. We did one in 2021 and another one last year uh, around how often people are coming downtown. And the one we did in 2021 suggested people weren't coming downtown very much. We were trying to get a sense of what people's perceptions were of the city, uh, and people had strong opinions about downtown, but most people said they hadn't been here very often. What was interesting in the poll we did last fall was that most people were downtown pretty frequently at that point. I think I'm just checking to see real quick if I have that number, but I'll say it was a strong majority, three quarters or something along those lines, had been downtown in the last month. Uh, Not necessarily for work or anything, but for some occasion. And what was interesting to me about that is people's perceptions. If you compare the poll of 2022 and the one of 2021, they were really about 16 or 17 months apart. People's perceptions of downtown got worse the more frequently they were downtown. So it wasn't just that they were, hearing bad things on the news or something like that. The more often they were here, uh, the the less pleased they were with how it was going. The employment department did have some numbers, and I'm just checking to see if I could find them. Um, uh, uh, on how many people worked downtown before the pandemic, and it's not coming up uh, right now, uh, but it was a substantial number. It was a substantial part of the Portland area's workforce was downtown, was working downtown before the pandemic.
And I think you and I have talked about this quite a bit over the last few months. In particular, there's continues to be sort of this pretty negative perception of downtown Portland. And certainly there has been a bit of reporting that I have done and some of our colleagues have done that have spotlighted or highlighted some concerning issues or trends that are going on within the central city. Yet, and at the same time, there is the picture that's emerging, at least sort of anecdotally speaking, and if you actually spend time down here, is that there are in many ways between 2021 and 2022, things have greatly improved, and there is a lot of really I would say encouraging things happening here as well. And I'm wondering how you sort of square those two.
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, as somebody who's downtown, almost every day, the idea that downtown Portland is abandoned, or that it's this, shell of itself, or that there's, trash, graffiti, and violence everywhere. I mean, no, that's not it. There's a lot of people downtown. There's a lot of activity, and by and large, downtown's a fairly clean place. I think, as you and I have discussed before this and on other occasions, what's striking is that you can go from one block to another and go from something that seems very vibrant and something that's really humming to a block where things are quite distressed. And I think that's unnerving to people, especially if they're not downtown day in and day out. If they're only here occasionally, you've come across a block and you're like, boy, that's unpleasant. And uh, that's been really striking for people, and I think it's discouraging for people to come downtown. Uh, in terms of the numbers, we don't have solid numbers on just how many people are downtown recently, but we do know something about office vacancy, and it's something like a fifth of offices are vacant, but the numbers are really worse than that. Colliers says that they talk about shadow spaces that are leased but aren't occupied because nobody's coming in. And they say that's about 40% of downtown is that way. And they think that number could rise to 50%. So half of all offices would be empty, whether or not they're actually leased next year. So things will forecasters seem to think things will get worse before they get better in terms of people coming downtown. Uh,
And certainly
so
that's not an issue that is unique to Portland.
no,
And yet, I think you and I have seen sort of study after study showing that in terms of post-pandemic recovery for downtown areas of major American cities, Portland consistently, it's not just one study, right? Like
yeah.
multiple studies are showing that Portland is ranking at the bottom, the absolute bottom in terms of its recovery of its central city. Why is that?
Well, I think one element of it is because we might have had farther to fall in a way, in that we had a more vibrant downtown than many other places coming into the pandemic. And so we were more disrupted when people came in less frequently. Uh, I, I think that's probably the major reason. I think part of it may also be there are different levels of cultural tolerance for remote work in different parts of the country and among different industries. And the kinds of industries that Portland has maybe are especially tolerant of remote or hybrid work. Uh, the U.S. Bancorp Tower, Big Pink, was pretty assertively switching itself from the professional services firms, from lawyers, accountants, and things like that, maybe before the Great Recession, to be more welcoming to tech uh, after that. And there were a lot of big tech companies like New Relic that were taking up multiple floors in there. Well, the tech is particularly given to remote work now. And let me just call up the number here. Our colleague Noel Crombie got the number. The managers of Big Pink said they had 3,000 people a day working in that downtown skyscraper before the pandemic. They put the number at 600 now. So I think that's part of what's going on is the type of industry we have and the type of employer we have here has been more tolerant of people working remotely.
And why don't you talk a little bit now about sort of what's the present snapshot of downtown Portland?
Yeah, well, I had an article earlier this month trying to get a sense. There was reason to believe that more people might be coming downtown in May. It's time of big festivals. It's Cinco de Mayo. It's the beginning of the Rose Festival. And then on top of that, the city of Portland began requiring workers to spend about half their time, most workers to spend about half their time on site. At Amazon, which has two big offices on Southwest Broadway, began requiring workers to spend more time in the office. And in Seattle, where Amazon's based, and has many times more workers than in Portland, there was discernible big uptick in the number of people coming downtown when that kicked in. So I tried to get a sense of whether or not that was happening here. And the numbers didn't really bear it out. I got the parking data and transit data. I'd looked for bridge traffic coming into downtown too, but wasn't able to find that. Apparently, neither the city nor the county keeps daily or monthly counts. But among people parking on the street or in the city's smart park garages, and this doesn't capture everyone, but it may be in some ways representative. Parking has essentially flatlined or plateaued. It's at about 40% of what it was. Sorry, it's at about 60% of what it was, down about 40% from before the pandemic. And there's really been very little change the last 2 years, including May of 2023. It's just about where it was a year ago. Not much uptick. So I wondered about TriMet and whether light rail or buses were bringing more people downtown. And downtown ridership in May was up 15% from a year earlier, which sounds good and promising and maybe a step in the right direction. But overall, TriMet ridership was up 19% year over year, May 2023 compared to May 2022. So that suggests that downtown isn't getting sort of an outsized burst of more activity. It's kind of level around. So that doesn't say great things about people returning to the office having an impact downtown. And that sort of everyday traffic is really important to economists. They say, well, you want people downtown because then they're using the shops, the professional services, the dry cleaners, garment repair, cobblers, shoe repair things downtown. And they're eating at restaurants and things. And that's the sort of thing that feeds into itself. But it doesn't appear it's picking up. Other indicators are more positive, though. The weather was really good in May, and Cinco de Mayo typically draws somewhere a wide range, depending on the weather, between 30,000 and 60,000 each year. This year it was 53,000, so it was very much at the high end. And the number of hotel rooms nights sold in the first 4 months of the year, they were up 20% for a year ago downtown. So those numbers, the way we were reading them is after I collected them was it suggests that Portland has reached a new normal in terms of office work downtown, and there doesn't seem to be a lot that's budging that up. But when it comes to travel or entertainment, it appears people still will come downtown, whether they're on vacation or here for work, or they live here and are looking for an activity, entertainment downtown. People are inclined to come downtown for the right occasion.
So what is long term here, if we've reached a sort of new normal in
Ah,
terms of number of people, office workers coming to the central city, uh, does this present an existential threat to the city center or to I mean, it's in some ways too. Downtown Portland is sort of the economic hub or engine for the rest of the state. Now, you don't necessarily need workers located, concentrated in a downtown core to run that economic engine statewide. But at the same time, I'm just curious, absent of a huge sea change in terms of people's attitudes and sort of choices with working at this point in time. What does that mean in terms of, yeah,
it's an enormous challenge, and whether it's an existential threat or just going to be a long-term economic drag, it's a little bit hard to see at this point. Uh, but it's really hard to see what would change. I'll say a couple things that people have talked about. One is that we've had a very, very tight labor market since the end of the pandemic. Until very recently, there were more job openings in Oregon than there were unemployed people. And so that meant people looking for work or people who have jobs but might be thinking about switching, they had a lot of leverage. They could say, if you make me come into the office, I'm going to just go over and work for somebody who doesn't make me come into the office. So, it's very convenient to do my job at home, and I feel like I can be productive. So that's the way I'm going to do it. And employers had no recourse. I think it's an open question whether employers in the long run will want employees to come in because they can save on real estate costs. But let's say employers, for the moment, do want workers to come back. Well, under those circumstances, they didn't have a lot of leverage to make that happen. The labor market will eventually loosen and employers will have more leverage if that's what they want to do. The cost of leases will also come down. That might make it more appealing for them to lease a space downtown, and that could work for the city. But another thing people have talked about, which I think is far less encouraging, is the idea that people might, office building owners might convert office buildings into residential apartments or condos. Portland, like many other West Coast cities, has an acute shortage of housing. That has not proved, for a variety of reasons, very promising. The city has established some incentives to try and encourage people to take a look at that, but it will be a slow and expensive process. Office buildings were not built; they were not wired, or the plumbing isn't designed for homes or to be subdivided to become living spaces. And doing it won't always be possible. And when it is, it will be slow and expensive. And it's not clear that people do want to live in downtown Portland in large numbers. We have, just shortly before the pandemic, Shane, as you know, there's a very nice looking apartment building that opened more or less across the street from our office. And we can easily look on their leasing site and see that a very large portion of those apartments have never been leased and are sitting empty right now. And so I think it's going to be a strain for a long time. There will be some equilibrium at some point. Leases will come down enough that it will make sense for businesses to lease them, and even if employees are just in the office periodically. But it's going to be a long process. And as your question, as I say, is this an existential threat? I just don't think we know at this point. All we can say is that Portland doesn't appear to be worse off than some other cities like New York or San Francisco, and we didn't have a big office building boom heading into the pandemic. So it's we don't have a lot of new space under lease with loans sitting out that could create larger economic ripples. And our colleague Jeff Manning just reported, the Davis Wright Tremaine is moving into the new Ritz-Carlton building. There are still certain types of businesses that are looking for space downtown.
And I think one last question I'll just throw out there, and then we can sort of wrap this up. But what is fundamentally different between Portland's downtown and Seattle's downtown? Because you just sort of lumped Portland together with San Francisco and New York in terms of its sort of overall health and recovery, and yet our neighbor 3 hours to the north appears by many measures to be doing a much better job with its downtown recovery. And any insights you can share with that?
I think a big part of it, and if we looked at that, Shane, I think we'd see a change in trajectory. I think Portland and Seattle were very similar in 2020 and 2021 as far as what was happening downtown. I think one thing Seattle has going for it is an anchor tenant, and that anchor tenant is Amazon. Mm-hmm. And one big employer deciding to come back makes a big difference. Portland doesn't have that one big employer who can say, okay, we're going to pull the switch. We have a number of, moderately large employers, and they would all have to arrange around that for it to happen. And so I think that's one advantage that Seattle has. I'll tell you though, Portland has some other advantages. One of them is geographic. If you look at, downtown Seattle, it's on sort of the edge of the metro area there. It's pushed up against Elliott Bay. Downtown Portland is at the geographic center of the metro area. East, west, north, south, all the suburbs are arrayed around downtown. And all the major freeways and transit lines come through downtown. So there's a lot that would just the center of gravity will just pull people down here from, over time, intermittently. We do have other good things going for us too. We have Portland State University, and we have a downtown that, well, like Seattle's, is quite beautiful. So there are reasons to come, but we have some headwinds that we're still fighting against.
Well, Mike Rogoway, this has been, I wouldn't say it's been a totally feel-good conversation, but it's certainly, it's certainly a topic that I think both you and I take a great deal of interest in. So it's always a pleasure chatting with you about these things, and appreciate you spending a little bit of time sharing what you know with our listeners.
Yeah, well, it's good talking to you, Shane. It's a subject of abiding interest, as I say.
Well, so folks, I'll drop some links to relevant stories and articles that we talked a little bit about here in our show notes, where you can read more about downtown Portland. With that, I'll call it a wrap. Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And come on, just tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to the Oregonian Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.